specifically scale-free networks. And we were talking about several types of networks. One is the issue of ring lattice networks. And I had started this whole thing because I argued a ring lattice network is intrinsically 1D. And you have local connections in 1D, essentially, even though it may be displayed in 2D. Okay, what were other sorts of networks we talked about last time? Poisson random networks. What was the characteristic of that? Yeah, each edge is equally likely. And so there's no preference according to connecting up people who live in similar areas, for example, or located in similar areas, like there would be with some other types of networks. It also doesn't make it any more likely, if two people are connected, A and B are connected, a given person C is no more likely to be connected to both B and A and B than the probability of being connected with A times the probability of being connected with B. There's in other words, there's no assortivity in the sense that we know in the world if two people are friends, then they often have a lot of friends in common. They often know a lot of people in common. That's not really captured in a Poisson random network. Instead, it's what we call a global network structure. So it exhibits global connectivity because there's no preference for locality like there is in a ring lattice network. What's another network that we examined that has preference for locality in 2D? It's okay. That's good, and it can be in 2D. So that a small world is sort of a weighted combination, as it were, on the one hand of a ring lattice, often mostly ring lattice, combined with a what sort? Poisson random. So it has a few global connections, often sprinkled, rewired from what's otherwise a ring lattice network. So a lot of locality, some global connection. Well, we also looked at something that was local in 2D. It was the spring mass does draw people together, so it actually does achieve locality in 2D based on people's network connection. That was something, a grid network, yeah, or a distance-based network. If the two people are connected, A and B are connected if and only if they lie within a certain distance of each other, right? Okay. So those are some network types. The final network type we discussed was a scale-free network. And I thought we'd devote a whole lecture to this because it's a particularly interesting class of networks, one that's capturing a lot of attention. It's capturing attention in the health area, to be sure, but it's also capturing attention, for example, computer networks. So people have observed the internet. If you consider nodes as machines in the or sites in the internet, and you consider as links, URL links from one site to another through URLs, it turns out that it matches features of scale-free networks. There's relationships between companies, aspects of software programs. The connectivity among classes and software programs has been shown to exhibit scale-free properties in some cases. So that's a kind of it captures a certain universal pattern that's around. So you recall that we introduced it through discussion of heterogeneity and contact rates. And the idea here was that there was a long tail associated with contact rates. So we have this log-log graph. We log the number of partners over a 1 year period and the frequency. We get this log-linear, this log-log scale that's described by a log. And we'll see why that comes out mathematically in a few minutes. And for different subgroups, it exhibits slightly different properties. But what's striking here is just how long this tail is. Most people, fewer partners, but a surprisingly large number of partners for some individuals. And you get this sort of consistent scaling relationship that we'll see is described by power law. Okay. It's described by a situation where the probability of having k partners is proportional to k to the minus And this has been observed for different populations and different subpopulations, for example. And we argued that in the sense of contagion, spreading ideas or spreading pathogen or what have you, this heterogeneity is important. Someone with a high number of partners is both more likely to be infected and, given infection, more likely to pass it on. So these people are really important. They're actually, people with large number of connections are valuable if you can affect their behavior, or even if you can use them for testing. If you can get them tested, you might be able to detect the presence of a circulating pathogen, for example, sooner. Or you might find out about new ideas sooner if you talk to the people who are highly connected. They sort of gather those ideas much more readily. So one thing I'd like to show you is how people within the aggregate modeling area, harking back to our use of differential equations, try to capture some of these effects and the effects of heterogeneity, okay, of variability, and why those attempts encounter problems with scale-free networks in particular. Why scale-free networks are such a troubling prospect. Why is it that they throw wrenches into traditional ways of capturing heterogeneity and really push us towards agent-based modeling, push us towards a situation where we represent each individual. So you folks will recall this infection term of Y is the number of infectives. We have this situation where we have X is the number of susceptibles, Y is the number of infectives, and the reasoning being a given infective infects C people per unit time overall. Of the entire population, Y over N are infected. So we'll assume that C times Y over N is roughly the number of infectives with which a given susceptible comes into contact, and then for each of those, and this is an approximation, multiply times beta, a certain chance of transmission, and that gives an overall likelihood, approximation to likelihood a given susceptible will get infected. So that was kind of the reasoning here, and we're going to see how this gets modified for the case of heterogeneity. So this is the key term. This is the transmission term. And what it's not capturing is the fact that not all here of interest is that not all infectives are the same. Some people have lots of contacts and some people have fewer contacts. So the idea here is that people came up with is that we disaggregate by contact rate. So essentially we break the population up that we're dealing with into groups according to their rates of contact. So essentially into risk groups with higher and higher levels of contacts. And if call X sub I and Y sub I are susceptibles and infectives who contact I other people per unit time. Okay. So we divide it into categories. This in general is how we deal in an aggregate model with heterogeneity. We remember in an aggregate model we organize the model according to state, that is, and characteristics. So we have these boxes that count the number of individuals, these stocks that count the number of individuals with a certain type of health state and a certain characteristic, say male, female. And if we want to add a new characteristic, we just create separate copies of the stocks for those with that characteristic and those without. Here we can divide up the susceptible population into susceptibles with 0 contacts per unit time, 1 per unit time, 2, etc. Has to be discrete categories. If we didn't want if we wanted continuous categories, what sort of equation would we have to use? Anyone? We're departing the province. If we want continuous categories here instead of discrete, we're departing ordinary differential equations. What sort are we getting into? Partial differential equations. Partial differential equations would allow you to characterize, for example, spread of heat over a two-dimensional surface. And so it is with this. We could use partial differential equations. Partial differential equations get to a whole other level of sophistication in terms of the computation required to solve them. There's multiple types, elliptic, hyperbolic, etc., and there's special methods for different types. Lies outside the scope of the course, and they tend not to be as widely used because people often go to agent-based models when they require that level of specificity because of the extra flexibility allowed there. So here we divide up susceptible into discrete categories. We have susceptible with low amounts of contact, higher successively, and something with infectives, okay? So we subdivide the population. And the first attempt that we might put together is we have, okay, here, if we consider the rate of change and the number of people who are infective with I contacts per unit time, we might take I times this total number of infectives over n times beta times x sub I. And here, you'll notice the I here, we've captured heterogeneity in rates. Why is this I here? This is not imaginary. This is not the square root of -1. This is not what we engineers call J sometimes. This is I. Why is I there? If we're considering people with a certain number of contacts per unit time, Y sub I, so these are change in the number of infectives per unit time, the rate of change in the number of infectives per unit time. Why is there an I here? I is the number of contacts they have per unit time. What is this replacing in the original equation? Yeah, C, because I is the contact rate for this group. So people with 0 contacts per unit time would have 0 here. People with 1 would have 1. And you could have people go back and forth between different rates of contact over time if you wanted to, but the point is for this subgroup it's I. Now what does this leave out? So that's great. We have different people with different rates of contact. People with 0 have 0 risk of infection. People with 1 are 1 here. People with 2 are 2. That's capturing some of the effects. What's left out of here? What's left out? There's actually something important missing. We've gone a certain distance, and we've improved the approximation, but there's still something missing. Well, with whom are we assuming those contacts are made? Well, it could be with anyone. We're sort of glossing over who are these contacts with. Disproportionately, their contacts will be with whom? The contacts will tend to be with other high number of contact people, is the thing. Because they're having contacts, let's suppose you have someone having contacts with large numbers of people. Chances are higher than not that a lot of those contacts will be with people who are also having contacts with lots of people. You ain't gonna have contacts with people who have 0 contacts per unit time at all. And you're more like, if there's some people out there having 1,000 contacts per unit time, you know, put aside the imagery here, but if there's people out there with tons and tons of contacts, in a given contact, you're more likely to run into one of them than someone who's having 1, okay? So we've been assuming here that our I contacts are equally spread among those people. In fact, they're skewed towards those with a high number of contacts. People with high number of contacts are more likely to be infected. You know, if we go take a bus here in Saskatoon, we're more likely to see on the bus frequent bus takers than someone who never takes a bus or someone who rarely takes a bus. It's not evenly distributed in terms of our mixing with people in Saskatoon. We're skewed towards other people who have similar habits. Okay, so how can we take that into account? How can we weight this accordingly? Anyone? Yeah, so we could do something like this. So here, now we're considering, now we have a ratio here. Is this a ratio of people? It's actually a ratio of people weighted by the amount of contacts they have, or contacts, total contacts per unit time over the entire population. So here we're summing up over the entire population, whatever state they're in, times the number of contacts they have. So this is the total contacts per unit time made in the entire population. And we're taking what fraction of those contacts are with high contact people. Do you see that? So that's what this is here. Now, these are the infectives, and we're given infective with a certain rate of contact. They're having a certain number of contacts. So here we're taking the fraction of all contacts that are occurring among people in the entire population that are made by infectives. Does that make sense? The fraction of contacts in the entire population that are made by infectives. So your X sub I and Y sub I are the susceptible infectives who contact I other people per unit time. And we're taking into account the fact that you consider people with I contacts, they have I contacts per unit time, and then they have contacts with other people, but in terms of their chance of running into someone who's already infected, we take into account that what's going to disproportionately impact that is the fact that people with large number of contacts, is the infection status of people with large number of contacts. So this fraction indicates the fraction of contacts in the entire population that are with an infected person. That's what this is now. We're not dealing with fraction of the population that's infected, because that weights everyone equally. Whereas really we should really recognize that if you're having contact at all, you have a predilection to be contacting someone who has a high number of contacts per unit time. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's go on for here, right? So here we have this sort of force of infection term, which is excuse me. That's it should be actually C. Should actually be I times beta times that. But let's go take a look at this. Okay, because if we consider a given susceptible X, they have the force of infection is the chance that they'll get infected per unit time. And that chance is associated with how many contacts they have times the fraction of those contacts they have with infectives times beta. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So there should actually be an I up front here. But we could actually go refactor this this equation in this sort of way. In other words, we could represent it as an equation on delta. The interesting thing here is that what we have here is something very, very similar to a normal SIR system, but where C is actually equal to this ratio now. So I actually haven't described the details of this, but fundamentally, if we have an equation here, and again, I should be here, we substitute it into this, we could end up deriving this differential equation. But here we have a situation where C equals this ratio right here, and in effect, this R naught, a basic reproductive number, the average number of people that a given susceptible infects in a totally susceptible population equals beta times this thing times D. Now, here, we could actually go and calculate a value for sigma associated with the variance of J over the entire population. So people in the population vary in terms of their contact rates, and we could look at the variability in this and reformulate it in this way. And what we would find actually is that essentially we can represent a system like this, a system just like this. We can actually represent it as if we could have an adjustment factor for C, essentially. Okay, so here we've actually taken into account with whom the contacts are held. If we wanted to represent it instead as y over n, we could do so with a single c and a single y and a single x if we just have a different value of c. So instead of just having c up front, the average number of contacts per unit time, what we instead are going to need is the mean of C, which is normally what we put in there exclusively, plus the variance of C over the mean of C. This is something actually called the excuse me, if it were the coefficient of variation, it would be standard deviation of the mean. But it's something similar. So normally, if we have no variability, C is equal to this. It's just the mean of contacts per unit time. Okay, the mean of the J over the entire population. Here, we actually need this extra term to represent variability. And notably, it depends on the variance in J. In other words, the variance in contact rates between people in the population. But it's interesting in the sense that we could have an aggregate model not broken down by contact rate, and it will actually behave the same as model broken down by it as long as you adjust C upwards by this extra factor. Okay? So in other words, you could simulate with an aggregate model without breaking down by contact rate the number of people infected over time, and it will accord with this model that is broken down by it if in that totally aggregate model you don't have just C, but the classic sort of M as C, but you have C being M plus the variability squared, so the variance over the mean. So in other words, with a totally aggregate model, you can adjust the C, so it doesn't merely represent the average number of contacts per unit time someone has, but it's average plus variability of contacts. Okay? Does that make sense to people? That you can adjust for that. I don't expect you to understand all of the details here, but the point is, for this derivation, you can actually derive an equivalence based on this, and essentially reformulate this guy as so this equation using these terms, and then you can derive this relationship. Now with scale-free networks, this becomes really problematic. So in short, if you had a Poisson random network, one of these networks with variability, you could plug in the variance across people, you could plug in the mean here, and actually get a nice description of how it spreads. What we'll find is that this breaks down for scale-free networks, and there's a reason for it. Okay. Scale-free networks exhibit, you could say, too much variance. They break this system. They break this formulation. They cause it to break down. Okay. So let's go take a look at why. So what was the characteristic of scale-free networks that was most pronounced? We had, you may remember that we had locality being captured in 1D being captured by ring lattice. We had it in 2D being captured, for example, by a distance-based network. We had sort of this phenomena of small worlds that a small number of global connections can have a disproportionate impact. We had that captured by a small world network in its classic form. Scale-free networks capture the effect of what? Well, it was huge variability associated with connections. And the observation here is these networks often come about when you have a situation where there's preferential attachment informing the network. So let's think about something like a website. If your website has many links already to it, someone's more likely to discover it. Because they're more likely to discover it, they're more likely, if they add a given link to their site, a cross-link, they're more likely to add it to your site. If you're very, very well known if you're a company site and you're widely liked on Facebook, someone may be more likely to sort of come across it and more likely to like you than they would even if you were already less popular. So in this situation, we have the occurrence of a certain number of links. The larger number of links you already have, the greater the likelihood you get another link. And so it is actually with the governing of quite a few systems. You'll have to sort of preferential buildup of connections. So let's talk about scale-free networks. If we denote a node's number of connections as k, and we consider a situation, the formatting is terrible, the chance of having k partners, k links, is proportional to k to the minus gamma. We'll talk about the constant proportionality in just a minute. This describes a surprising number of systems. For human sexual networks, gamma varies between 2 and 3.5. Now we'll talk about the meaning of gamma in just a moment, but it has to do with this sort of scaling. What's notable is that it scales as a power of k. Okay? So it may, the chance of having k partners may go down as essentially 1 over k squared, 1 over k cubed, or even 1 over k if gamma is 1. So here we have a power law. It exhibits invariance of scale. This is one of the most interesting features of it, and that's why it's called a scale-free network. Scale-free in the sense that, however you zoom in terms of the number of links you're looking at, it sort of looks the same. Okay, so here I have it written as x. It should really be written as k, but let's consider it the same thing. Yeah. Correct. There's no geometrical locality. And okay, so if you're saying locality, right, even topological, are you more likely to be connected with someone who's nearby? No. But if there's someone who's widely popular already, and you're forming the network, you're more likely to be connected to that person than someone else. But there's no notion of sort of temporal locality. You're more likely to be connected to somebody who's already nearby you or something like that. I'm not answering that really well, but in any case, what dictates it is the number of connections they already have, rather than something about their position in the network. Okay, well, that's an interesting question. You could have some mixture of the two where yes, you could. In fact, I have a little algorithm I created last week that could exhibit things like that. So I might get connected with people nearby me geometrically who are more likely to connect to people nearby me who already have lots of connections or something like that. And so there'd be locality captured, but also a sort of scale-free property captured in terms of connection. So why do we say it's scale-free? Well, let's consider the number of connections, the probability of having x connections. It's equal to some constant of proportionality c times x to the minus gamma. That's what it means. That's why we say it goes as x to the minus gamma. It's proportional to x to the minus gamma. This is a constant of proportionality. Now let's suppose we consider, so suppose we're dealing with x equals 10. Number of people with 10 partners per married. The number of the likelihood a given company has 10 supply chain suppliers. Now we want to consider the probability of alpha contacts. So maybe alpha 2, 20. Probability of the thought 20. Well, what is that? It's c times alpha x to the minus gamma. And we could pull the alpha out in front, and we have get this thing times x to the minus gamma. And fundamentally what we're going to have is, the important insight here is alpha to the minus gamma is just some constant. Just some constant. And so, in short, no matter how many partners we're considering in human terms, or how many supply chain things a given company has, the probability another company will have, twice that number, for example, is just proportional to the value of the probability of having x. In other words, it doesn't become any less likely as you double x that you'll have twice as many. Okay. In other words, this function looks the same at any scale. It's just multiplied by a different constant up front. We have a situation where as x rises, the probability of doubling it just goes up by the same amount each time. So we may go down, the probability of having twice as many people, it may be 1/3 of the probability of having that base number of people. So going from 10 to 20, 20 may be only 1/3 as likely as 10. Going from 20 to 40, 40 will be only 1/3 as likely as 20. Going from 40 to 80, only 1/3 as likely as 40. So you have this successive sort of lowering of probability, but in the same way regardless of scale. Okay, and it turns out that, and I might have time to talk about this before classes, and it's one of the most interesting features. It's hard to overstate how substantive the issue is, but fundamentally you can get power law scaling from any sources, and one of the key sources is dimensional structure. The fact that there's certain types of dimensions involved that have certain exponents associated with them. So we describe a quantity as, for example, dollars per person, or we describe something as liters per meter cubed, or what have you. The fact that we have these dimensional constants, we have these exponents here, will give rise to power law scaling in many cases. And there's a deep theory as to why these come out of it in the scale field property. The key thing, though, is that power law probability distributions often have long tails. So they have heavy tails. In other words, they have a quite high number. If you have this sort of power law, particularly if gamma is small, if it's 1, 2, or 3, you actually have quite a few things still out there, very large values of x. Very, very large. And we'll see that causes problems with the sort of aggregate treatment of heterogeneity. So plotting out a power law function on a log-log plot yields a straight line. Why is that? Well, if we have probability of having x, value of x connections, equal to c times x to the minus gamma, you take the logs of both sides. Right? Take log of p of x, it equals c minus gamma times log of x. This latter term, gamma times log of x, is just log of x to the minus gamma. And then, so you get this value. Now, this is a log-log. This leads to a log-log plot. We're plotting the log on one axis, and we're plotting the log on the other axis. So here we have log on the y-axis, log of p of x, and on the x-axis we have a log of x rather. And so this log naturally leads to a line with negative slope, where the negative of the slope. What is this slope here? It's minus what? Gamma. It's minus gamma. Oh man. Okay, I didn't even have to ask before I tried to write it. Okay, so it's minus gamma. There we go. Man, these things are sorted randomly. This is like the desperation cache. Okay. So here we have the fact that the impact of scaling is always identical by the same quantity. What is a doubling look like on the x-axis here? If we're plotting log of x, if we double x, what do we do? What does it lead to on this axis? It moves by a constant amount over. Doubling it again moves by same amount. So doubling leads to this. And all it leads to is some constant decrease for each successive interval in log of p of x. So this is exactly why we get this sort of scattering we saw in the graphs associated with this. Now, I've seen this come out in data where I didn't expect it. So we work with a lot of data about human mobility, for example, and this just reaches and pops out at you from unexpected places. We work with data on how long people spend together, and this sort of relationship just reaches out and punches you. It's amazing. It just shows up in different places. And again, it has to do with underlying dimensionality considerations in many cases. The underlying observation here is this sort of scale free nature. So if gamma equals 2, for example, doubling x always divides p of x by 4, no matter what x is. If you're dealing with people, 10 partners to 20, divide by 4 to go from probability of 1, probability of another. Or another way to put it is, there's going to be 4 times as many people with 10 partners per year as there are with 20 partners. There's going to be 4 times as many people with 20 partners per year as with 40 partners per year. There's going to be 4 times as many partners with 40 people per year as with 80. So no matter how far you go out, it goes down in the same sort of way. Gamma equals 3, it goes down faster, to be sure. Doubling x here divides by 8. Why 8? Where does this come from? What is this? This is 2 to the 3rd. Yeah. So we're going down by 8. Now, if gamma equals 1, it goes down really, really slowly. Now, for those who are remembering back to Maclaurin series, or expanding things into sums of powers of values, you may actually start to remember issues of convergence with these things, and we'll get to that in a bit. Okay. So these sort of patterns, this is what we get out. Exactly this sort of pattern. You notice there's variability, particularly down in the small area. Why do we see this variability? Why do you think we might actually expect a greater amount of variability down here? Yeah. Sample sizes are quite small. We're dealing here with relative frequencies, from up here, it's probably somewhere around, 2,000, something like that. 4,000, what have you, down to here, where we may be dealing with very small numbers of individuals, 10, 12, what have you. Okay, now, if we want to figure out what the constant of proportionality is, we've said that p of x, the probability of having p of k, for having k contacts, is equal to some c times k to the minus gamma. So what's this constant of proportionality? What's the c? Well, to figure out what this is, we could sum up over all k, right? This should sum up to what? Over all k. If I sum p of k over all k, what should I get? If this is a probability, what should I get? If I sum it up over all possible values, I should get, thank you, I should get 1. So what is the sum over all possible values of this? If I do it, c times gamma. So if I have c times, if I sum it up, this thing, it has to equal 1. So the sum of c times k to the minus gamma, just substituting in for p of k, right? In other words, the sum of p of k from k equals 0 to k equals infinity has got to equal 1. We know that. It's a probability, so they have to sum to 1. And I could just substitute in the definition of p of k. It could be c times k to the minus gamma. So here we have the sum of c times k to the minus gamma equals 1. I can pull the c out in front, right? I can pull the c out in front. And then I get c times quantity sum from k equals 0 to infinity of k to the minus gamma equals 1. So now, if I can just figure out what this quantity is, this sigma over k, the sum of all of from k equals 0 to infinity of k to the minus gamma. If I can figure out what that is, I can figure out what c is, right? I can get a value for c. It's constant proportionality. I'm just trying to get a value for c here. So what is that sum? Well, first of all, we don't have to worry about k equals 0. As long as gamma isn't 0. Correct. Yeah. I'm sorry. Okay, this is a good question. Sorry. So right. This is an interesting question. So why did I write it that way? That's a good question. Okay. Right. So often we will have zero contacts in some cases. I guess those are viewed. This is really interesting. I need to think this through. The awkward thing is what's going through my mind is why can't that neatly handle 0? Why don't we just say make this from 0 to infinity? What will happen? Why is it bad? Why am I squirming here about dealing with k equals 0? Why can't we just say, well, we'll plug it into this formula. What's k to the minus gamma for 0? Yeah. Okay, so for this derivation, it's true. We're assuming the probability of having 0 contacts is 0. In general, we would have one term for 0 contacts, and then we would describe the rest with the power law. And basically, we would be needing to sum it up not to 1, but to 1 minus the number that have 0 contacts, the probability of having 0 contacts. You'll notice that in these graphs, there is the minimum is 1. Cool. And so that's the case of 0 is handled separately. So it's actually a really good point. The elves will have to work tonight to revise the slides. Score one up for me, Yvonne. Here, this is great. That's really good. I'm glad you caught that. Okay, so here we'll assume for now that the probability of k equals 0 is 0. So if we want to sum this up, well, folks, numerically, it's actually a lot easier to do in integral. So this is approximately that integral, and if we sum this up, what we end up getting is a fairly simple integral to do, to say the least, and we get something like this. You probably could have done this in AP calculus or what have you, and you get out this. So the PDF here, so this constant proportionality is going to be 1 over this, which is going to be gamma minus 1. Why 1 over it? Because C here, if C times sigma, sum over at k to the minus gamma equals 1, then we're going to have C equals 1 over, this exhibits stochastic, either that or it's deterministically decreasing at a shocking rate. This is
Must be the latter, it seems, because now it's doing nothing.
This is disconcerting. Okay, so C here is equal to 1 over sigma, and these should all be 1s. K equal 1 to infinity of k to the minus gamma. And so here we have C equal 1 over this, which is this. So here the PDF is going to be approximately this. So this value here, I think it's actually, I'd love to actually see if this could be cracked, but I think this is actually very, very close to it. Now, the interesting thing is the mean of this, if we take this PDF, we substitute it in as P of x. And now we take the mean over all x's. So what are we doing? We're taking the mean from over all possible numbers of contacts times the probability of that number occurring. That gives the mean, right? X times P of x summed over all x, or integrated here over all x. Okay, we end up getting this as the mean. The variance goes as this. Now, does anything trouble you with that? Well spoken. Yes, that's exactly right. There's certain places where it doesn't exist, right? And if we're dealing with a situation where we have variability in gamma, in other words, for some scale-free networks, gamma equal to 1, gamma equal to 2, gamma equal to 3. What does that tell you about the mean and variance of that probability distribution? Let's suppose gamma equals 2. Is there a problem? It has no mean. In other words, there's such a heavy tail that the mean doesn't exist. Now, how about for variance? Well, gamma really needs to be actually above 3 for this to be meaningful. If gamma's below 3, but above 1, is a negative, which doesn't make sense for variance. So, what I'm trying to communicate here, and this is actually a very real issue, is if we approximate things to scale-free networks, and we stick to that approximation, at some point the mean and the variance don't exist. We can't speak about the variance in a well-defined sense. Now, the truth is that they're an approximation. The scale-free networks are approximate. There is going to be some variance. It's not going to adhere strictly to a scale-free network. With again, human sexual networks, it's I think between 2 and 3 point something. But even for the lower values, it will exist. The point is we have huge variance. The variance is huge associated with this. And what you get is, again, the situation of the tail wagging the dog. So here we have a situation where we have, if we had this correction, if we wanted to put in this correction to have a purely aggregate model, and we wanted to just substitute in, instead of using as the mean, the average number of contacts per unit time for people in the population, we want to take into account variability, this becomes a real problem. We can use this for certain types of networks, but for other types of networks, this isn't really well defined. In short, the variability dominates. It's not just the mean that dominates, it's the variability. It's the variability that drives things. It's not your average person in the population. Your average person in the population may have very low numbers of contacts, but that's not what matters. What matters is, in fact, the variance. And this is abstracting away from the issue of whether it's perfectly described by a scale-free networks. That's not the point. The point is that at some point, when you get networks which exhibit long tails, it's the variance which matters. It's not the average. Dealing with the average person is misleading. It would lead you to think, for example, an infection dies out when in fact it's really going to take off. This R naught, we didn't have much time to talk about this. I think I mentioned it during the classes, but this was the quantity where if it's above 1, it's the average number of people a given infective will infect in a purely susceptible population before they recover. Okay. So if it's greater than 1, the infection is going to be able to catch hold because they'll replace themselves with more than one person before they recover. And it'll be able to spread it with some. If it's less than 1, it's just going to peter out. They may, by luck, infect one person, maybe even 2, but those people will infect fewer than 1, and it's going to die out. Here, what this is saying to us is that we are really fooling ourselves if we only look at the mean. We're really fooling ourselves. And with a scale-free network, this latter term, the variance over the mean, blows away the mean. It's just incomparably larger than the mean. And so we have a situation where the variability among people drives things. The people with large number of connections who serve as magnet for getting infected and as magnet for disseminating it are driving the situation. Maybe they're only 1% of the population, but they lead to a situation the infection can take off, stay present within the population. So, you know, here with a sufficiently large population, R naught will always be greater than 1. The disease will die out even if most people have low numbers of particles. So here we have a situation with scale-free networks where the variance drives things in a big way. It is the defining sort of characteristic associated with spread of ideas or spread of infection, other aspects of pathogen. So scale-free networks exhibit this power law. They are incredibly common. I wouldn't be surprised if people within this room end up encountering these in data analysis in one form or another. You'll see them in physical systems. You'll see them in socio-technical systems with humans. You'll see them in data from, you know, ecological systems. They are a feature of the world that's very noticeable. And what's particularly prominent when you see a relationship with this, you should be thinking, wow, the variance is likely to be very large associated with this. And because of this, we may see unexpected properties like a very small segment of the population being disproportionately important, really being the dominant forces. And we'll see it, you know, in terms of the actual curves, like here, it's proportional to x to the minus gamma. Okay, so those are some features of scale-free networks. I wanted to use the remaining period of time here to talk about an idea which came up. I have to credit Yvonne for advancing this, and I think it's a dynamite idea and one I'm willing to go for. So, one of my challenges. So this course it's the first time this course is being taught in many years, and one of my challenges in recreating it was to structure it. My thought was to have a form of this course which would eventually include an incorporated project, but I wanted to be cautious about imposing it on this term because I thought we'd try out the material, see how things go, see how well people, how comfortable people felt. I'm feeling pretty good about how things are going overall. I would, because of that, I am open to the idea of having students work on a practical project for some part of their marks for this course. So this course involves marks associated with 3 sources. One is the assignments you've been working on. One is a final exam that's required. Not that I can do something about. And final exams for undergrad courses, there's strict rules on how much of the grades they have to incorporate. So I've limited flexibility for that. But the other component is pop quizzes, and I've been under-popping you, to say the least. Now, I could impose more pop quizzes, and I will have to impose them at high temporal density for the remainder of the term, which I could do. One wonders if I should have imposed one today, given the attendance. But the thought had come up of, and Yvonne had suggested it, wait a minute. If we're getting, I think it's 18% of the mark associated with pop quizzes, what if some students would actually be really interested in doing projects? And I'm totally good with this. I felt really torn launching this course without a project, because I actually think it's with projects that you learn the most. Problem sets, they're all well and good. and I think there's some interesting things you can learn. But it's really with projects you get the best experiences. So I'm going to put it forward as an option for people in this course to consider a project. Okay. Now, if you want to work on a project, you can do it in a group fashion, or you can do it individually. I will ask that you talk with me about the project. This is, frankly, it's more work for me, but I think it's really valuable, and I enjoy it, you enjoy it, so I think it's worth doing. I have some potential project ideas. There's limited time, and so we really have to make sure it's scoped, so that it's not overwhelming. But if people are interested, I would welcome you to advance ideas to me. I would also welcome you to talk with your colleagues. And essentially, you could take all the marks associated with pop quizzes for sure. I will try to, and I'm going to have to really consider how to do this. There may be some option of turning in the project as part of the final exam in some way. So, what's that? If so it depends how it's done.
It's worded in their contract.
If it's so, I'm gonna have to research this, is what it comes down to. But I think there are take-home type exams, and we treat it as part of that. I'm gonna have to go talk with the powers that be, but I'm hoping I might be able to get permission to essentially do something like that. I think I've seen that for other courses, and so I really want to. Is that right? Okay. They do that. Okay. Yeah, that was my understanding from talking to a senior colleague. And the goal would be to sort of have it so that you could choose whether to exercise this option or not. In other words, you could stick with the original marking scheme with no prejudice, and that's perfectly good, or you could choose to exercise this. I will need to think on my own about some of the ways of structuring this. Like I'd expect a brief, say, couple paragraph description of what you're planning, and then I could meet with you or something along those lines. I would then subsequently meet with you to work on delivering it. As far as due date, this is another thing university guidelines get into. And if you don't want to treat it as part of your final exam, we have to have it due in the last day of classes. I think you can't have it later than that by university rules. But I'm going to look into the rules for this, and I will send out mail to people. I'm hoping to get this fixed by tomorrow. Yeah.
This isn't for me to discuss this, but I know for a fact that there are a couple of people who've taken, say, history classes and turned in essays for marks up to a term and a half, 2 terms later. That I know personally, and the process then retroactive change mark, which is not necessarily something you'd want to do. It has happened before.
Milestone after the last day of classes.
Yeah, basically nobody has to know that the assignment is actually.
Okay. Yeah. So
I think it's the idea.
there's some facts of life here that I need to relate. The fact of life is that particularly for undergrads, it's extremely important that I turn in the marks within a defined time after the course finishes. And actually, I start to receive emails that prod me with increasingly painful jabs to sort of get me to turn in my marks for each successive day. More and more sort of, more and more evocative emails are sent to me, and eventually they start to get sent to powers that be above me. And so there's going to be in this case, there's no fooling around because some of you are 4th year students, and we have to get marks in on time. The way that works when you have this sort of retrospective submission is there's a temporary grade submitted, and then there's grade change form. Okay. And I cannot submit the grades for anyone before submitting the grades for everyone. That's the way I'm a slave to an IT system. I literally cannot get it to submit without it'll say like you did not specify the grade for so and so, and so I have to submit a temporary grade, and after that, grade change forms come into the process, which is not overly onerous, but I have to justify something about them. So I have to say, what was it about the nature of the situation that made this happen?
What is history class,
I have
Well, yeah. There's professors differ with their level of callousness, or sort of degree of social callous that they've built up, but this has to be straightened out. I mean, I think for like if you turn it in within a few weeks, it's much less of an issue. A term and a half, I think people start to look really weird at you, and they'll start to say, you know, this could be a violation of policy, and you really have to justify it strongly. So there's probably some latitude around there. I have strong reason for thinking there's some latitude, but in any case, what I'm just proposing at this point is that you folks think about whether or not you'd be interested in doing a project. I will go back and figure out what's legal on the grade markings side and what could be achieved. At the least, what you can count on is that all the grades from pop quizzes end up being put instead into a project. That I will guarantee you. Okay, so if you want to do it, I can guarantee you that. More than that, like shifting grades from the final exam to it, by having as part of from the other parts of the final exam to that, by having a part of the final, I can't promise yet, but I will verify my understanding. Yeah.
Either way, though, we can probably expect that since there might be some students who will choose not to,
Right.
but there will be a much higher temporal density.
I think that's inevitable. There'll have to be one or two quizzes. Now, those who elect not to do the quiz, you know, could choose however they want to respond to that. You know, yeah, exactly. So you can choose, you know, how you want to respond to that, but you don't have to worry about pop quizzes if you elect to put it into this. You could view the project as a form of odd pop quiz. Yeah, but you will have to talk with me about projects, and I'm glad to work with teams too. My hope would be that you come up with an idea for a project yourself that inspires you. If you need a project description, I have some ideas that could work, but we'd have to talk about it. It involves transferring knowledge from me to you. So that involves a little bit of trickiness. Next time I offer this course, I mean, there's people around the world that would love students to do projects with them, and they actually have data, and they want to talk with the students and so on. But at this point, there's not time to really act fully on that. So that would have to wait till another semester. But I'm game for this. I will get back to you on what we can count on the marketing side in terms of flexibility within what the regulations allow. Okay, so I'll see if I can send mail, ideally tomorrow night or Saturday, about what we'll be able to do. I have to speak with our undergrad officer, etc., just to make sure we're all in good shape. Okay, so think about it. Feel free to send me mail if you want to get early comments on a project idea. But I think it would be really neat. I think it could be great, and I will commit to working with you during your projects to make sure that you get ongoing feedback and could get any suggestions. Okay. Okay. So that's all for today. Give it some thought and send me mail if you'd like.